Well,
The
actually, this is a really interesting point, because one of the things that I think happened to Western society generally over the course of the 20th century is the substitution of science for religion. The idea was that your religious leaders were not trustworthy because they provided you with certain solutions to life, and then they couldn't even uphold their own standards. This is, I think, what led to so much rage at the Catholic Church in the early 2000s after all of the scandals regarding pedophile priests and such. The idea was that these were the people who were supposed to lead us, and suddenly they've let us down. Well, the story of the 20th century is the substitution of scientists for kind of cultic leaders. The idea was these were the people who were going to lead us to a better tomorrow. They were always going to fix all of our problems. And there was some truth to it because, science has advanced enormously, the ability of human beings to live longer and more healthfully. But one of the things that has happened is the scientists forgot about epistemic humility. There's no humility to them at all. And so they make claims that are well beyond what they can actually prove. And you see it in virtually every area. They're just not willing to say the truth about what they know and really what they don't. That is most true in the area of psychiatry, where honestly the understanding of the human brain is extraordinarily rudimentary at this point. And yet you're told by the experts that they know like every jot and tittle of how neuroscience works. No, they don't. They really, really don't. And so because of that, people expect magic from folks, and you can't expect magic because there's no such thing as magic. So when the magic dissipates, then you're treating them exactly like you would treat a religious leader who you're disappointed in because he's violated your sense of faith in them.
You should read this book. It's called Desperate Remedies, I believe, which is a history of psychiatry, which is one atrocity after another, completely outside of science. But every single one of them is picked up by the establishment and touted as a great thing, including sticking an awl up people's nose and taking part of their brain out, which was lobotomy. And it makes Freud, who I believe was a brilliant quack, it actually makes him kind of a hero because at least he was only talking to people. He wasn't electroshocking them. He wasn't drugging them. He wasn't doing all these terrible things. But it is one history of failure after another. And, there's one other thing about what Ben is saying. When you look back at the 20th century, and because most of us lived in the second half of the 20th century, you forget what an absolute nightmare the 20th century was. Hitlerian fascism and Soviet communism were both scientific movements in a sense. They were both based in non-God, non-religious-based science. There's got to be some kind of clue here that science is a wonderful thing, but it's not the only thing.
I have two thoughts. One is that it's not, you said it, it's not just science, it's experts generally.
Yeah.
And in the same way that in the Middle Ages, the Catholic priesthood sort of soaked up all the 120 IQs in Europe, because there was nowhere else to be.
No.
And so if you had any smarts whatsoever, you went into the Catholic priesthood, and then that creates all kinds of problems across time, that you've completely centralized all of the people probably capable of having critical, any substantial level of critical thinking into one institution that has a very rigid set of parameters on what you're allowed to think. And so you've almost removed critical thought from society. We do the same thing now. We just do it through the institution of higher learning. And in the name of liberalism, it became the least liberal of all institutions. It is a religious institution that has very strict parameters on what you're allowed to think. And we placed everyone with 120 plus IQ in that system. And so now the people who should be having not critical theory, but actual criticism, actual critical thought about day-to-day life, critical thought about how we live, critical thought about the things that we've thought historically, the things now, the things that we might think in the future. They've all been institutionalized, as it were, into thinking one set of things. And you see this everywhere. So if you had said, if you said during COVID that you doubted, for example, that hankies over your face was going to make a substantial dent in the spread of this, respiratory viral disease, it's not just that, that virologists would come out and tell you were wrong. It's that all experts at all levels would come out and tell you that you were wrong with absolute authority and absolute certainty about things that they knew absolutely nothing. You see it, I think about this in every level of the expert class right now. If you question the narrative on anthropogenic global warming, and they'll say 98% of scientists agree, right? But 98% of scientists have absolutely no knowledge about climatology. You mean that heart surgeons agree, and they do. And you mean that lawyers agree, and they do. And you mean people with gender studies degrees agree, and they do. The institutionalization requires that whatever my degree is in, for it to have any value, I have to accept that you're as expert about your degree as I am about my degree, and it creates this unbelievable echo chamber.
I think that's
and the rest of us have just deferred all of our critical thinking to the
it's
institution.
a brilliant insight. The greatest example of it is NASA, the moonshot. They sucked all the talent out of the room, and after the moonshot, basically the space program died. And
Right.
It died because they were all in the government instead of off somewhere saying, you know, I have this other idea.
And it took 40 years to challenge
That's
that.
right.
And the other part of the story that makes this such a problem is that you have the experts saying, leave everything to us. And you have the American public, many of which have been conditioned to sort of look for the easiest answer. And so a lot of people are more than happy to just farm that out to the so-called experts and let them deal with it. That's especially the case with psychiatry and the antidepressant study, which, by the way, what's so sinister about that is it's not like this study just came out revealing that all these antidepressants were prescribed on a faulty basis, and we just found this out this week. No, this has been known for decades. Psychiatrists and doctors have known for decades that the chemical imbalance theory of depression is not true. That was basically a guess that someone came up with decades ago, and it's been known that it wasn't true. Right.
Well, here's one evidence that it's not true: is the antidepressant use has skyrocketed.
That's right.
Since they started.
We're the most mentally ill generation in human history, and the most medicated.
Usually, when you come up with a cure for things, it goes away.
And they've done studies where they've compared antidepressants against placebos and found that, especially if it's an active placebo that gives you some kind of irrelevant side effect, there's no distinction between the two. But the problem is, even after this study came out, and I was talking about it on my show, and what I heard from a lot of people is, well, maybe this is all false, but it makes me feel better to take it.
No, I know.
Yeah.
So that's it.
My feeling is take the placebo.
Well, I mean, I will say that on the antidepressant issue, I mean, I think that there's a slightly more complexity to antidepressant use than what the study actually claims. What the study actually claims, correctly, of course, is that there's no relationship between low serotonin and depression, which was the chemical imbalance theory, right? Was that low serotonin was invariably connected with depression. Well, psychiatrists have known for a while, and this again demonstrates that all they do is the platonic lie, and this is the biggest problem. That disconnect between what they know and what they tell you is so great that the vast majority of the American public believes that the chemical imbalance theory is the going theory. I mean, if you poll Americans about that, they think that that's what is going on
it's about
in the human brain because they
85%
watched a bunch
think
of
that.
Yeah, I mean, they watched a bunch of commercials about Prozac in 1997, and it said this, right, in the commercials. And so everybody still believes that that's how this works. But psychiatrists will tell you that depression, like cancer, is actually a bundle of things, right? There are a bunch of different types of depression, ranging from mild to severe. There are a bunch of different causes of depression that we don't know the chemical causes of depression. Now, what you'll see from some psychiatrists and from some studies is that some antidepressants, depending on circumstance, may have a better effect than other antidepressants, depending on the person. And here's the key, though. They don't know why, right? And they can't just say that. The truth is that a huge amount of medicine is trial and error, right? Antidepressants actually SSRIs started off as tuberculosis drugs, in the same way that Viagra started off as a drug for heart arrhythmia. So very often, I mean, this is true right now for a huge number of medicines that we use. They're being used for the not original purpose of the medication. Because again, we are not that much farther advanced, except in some of our study techniques, from the days when it was like pick the red berry or pick the blackberry and see who dies and see who lives. And so very often what you're doing, so what you're doing very often with antidepressants, and this is true, is you'll see a person and they'll take 3 or 4 different antidepressants in a row until they get to the one that works for them. Part of the problem, again, with studies of depression is that also the effects are self-reported. There's no objectively verifiable metric to determine whether an antidepressant is working other than I tell a doctor that I feel better. So all this is really vague and really difficult, and it got simplified down into you have a chemical imbalance, take an SSRI, it'll cure you. And that's not true. And the black box warnings, by the way, on SSRIs are really, really troubling. I mean, you should really, what I've said on the show is, listen, there may be SSRIs that work for some people, but in the best of all possible circumstances, you should at least go through cognitive behavioral therapy and do your best via not drugs before you even start looking along those lines. Now,
and I say the only way to
and say
treat
that SSRIs are never useful because that's not true.
Erectile dysfunction and COVID-19 is essential oils.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I've just found that just a little peppermint.
I think, I know we had this conversation a few shows ago about mental illness, and not to retread that ground again, but there's this, I just think there's some flawed fundamental premise that we're starting with. And when we talk about, well, do the antidepressants work? What do we mean by that? What do you mean work? How do we know if they work? And what we mean is that it works if you take it and you just feel, I guess, kind of numb. You feel okay. You feel content. I don't know exactly, but is that even how people are supposed to feel every single second? That's the question. How are people supposed to feel? Like, how are people supposed to experience the world? And I think before you even think about prescribing a drug, obviously you got to go down the checklist of lifestyle choices, diet, sleep, all that. They don't do that. They just go right to the drug.
Well,
hold on a second. There's another thing on the checklist. Are you a mortal being living in this fallen world that is full of just misery and sorrow? And so my point is that I think depression is actually, it's a rational response to our condition as human beings, which isn't to say that we should always be depressed, but it takes more effort. It's a rarer thing to be happy and content.
No one asks the question. No one asks the question. Is telling people that they are bags of chemicals that can be adjusted depressing in and of itself? Because as we say, from the invention of these things, and I'm not totally against all drugs, all medical, psychotropic drugs. I'm not completely against it, but I'm against the idea. What you just said, I'm against the idea that should be your first guess. It should definitely be your very last guess. That there's no other reason to be depressed, and even the existential pain of life is not what's depressing you. Something's wrong.
I think this is an important topic, and we have spent some time, but I want to spend a little bit more time. But first, this is a really important topic. How is a person to feel? How are we supposed to feel? What's our reaction to our lives supposed to be? I say it all the time, we live in the most diagnosed and most drugged generation in all of human history, but not the happiest.
Well, I will tell you something. I feel, when I'm walking around, I'm just talking about my feelings, I feel as though I am taking heart arrhythmia drugs almost all the time. I feel really excited and
invigorated,
tumescent. And so part of the reason for this is, this really gets to Matt's point on there being a spiritual or metaphysical basis here. I was an atheist for about 10 years, and then I was not an atheist anymore. And it happened in kind of a whirlwind of a few years in there. And I will tell you, I'm way less depressed.
It's amazing.
I'm not taking any drugs, and I'm not. And it really is just a way of viewing the world. And I'm not saying I don't get sad. I'm not saying I don't feel grief or pain or stress or anxiety or any. I feel all of those things. But it is a huge change. I've taken a handful of chemicals in my life, especially in my college years, and that shift, that spiritual and metaphysical shift, is far more powerful.
And you know what's interesting too, to go back to what you were saying about just the existential state of the world, is religion is joy. I mean, and it's increasing joy all the time.
Yeah.
But it makes you more realistic.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. The brief against the attack on religion was always it was a fantasy. It was always, you have the sky daddy, whatever they say. But it's actually the opposite. You see the world so much more clearly. You know more what people are going to do. You know why they're going to do it, and you understand that it is what you say. It's a veil of tears.
By the way,
and I think
there's something else here too, and that is that one of the things that we found in Western societies have extraordinarily high rates of mental illness, suicidal ideation, depression. One of the reasons for that is something called choice theory. The idea is that when you provide people with too many choices, they freeze up in the faces of those choices, and they freak out, and they don't know what to do about that, because it turns out that people really do need structures, right? They really do need the roles that religion tends to provide. Religion is inherited wisdom of the past, and what they found, and again, this is all scientifically based, what they found is that cultures that actually have fairly strict roles in which you're expected to do things, and you have duties, and we kind of know what you're going to do on a day-to-day basis. Right? Those cultures have far lower rates of mental illness and suicidal ideation and depression, because again, you know what you are. You know where you lie in society. What we really have sort of discovered about human identity is that it's a combination of your biology combined with your sociological kind of inheritance, your cultural inheritance, combined with what choices you make for yourself. But we in the West, we've basically done away with the first two things. Right? We've done away with biology and the biological constraints placed upon you. And we've done away with your cultural inheritance. And all you are is just sort of a wandering bag of feelings in which you get to choose all of your own adventures. Well, the problem with that is that that's actually quite depressing. People are not built for precisely that. Now, again, I think that there are people who are severely depressed to the point where, they're losing weight, they can't sleep ever, and it's not just sort of a malaise, it's something much deeper. But I think that just like with any other mental illness in the West, we have now expanded the boundaries of that description to include a bunch of behavior that really is either transitory or borderline normal. I mean, this has happened in nearly every major mental illness in the West, and the most obvious example being gender dysphoria, right? There are people who actually do have gender dysphoria, and then there is 21% of the population of people under the age of 18 identifying as LGBTQ, right? Not the same thing.
Let me even push on that, though, Ben. I'm not sure that 25% of people don't have gender dysphoria. I'm not sure that 50% of people don't have gender dysphoria. I mean, I think that most children have some amount of gender confusion during their childhood. Some of it's fantasy, and some of it's much deeper than that, and much more prevalent than that. But one of the things that I think is that diagnoses themselves, amplify the phenomenon. So I know many people who, for some brief period of their childhood, like to wear their mom's shoes, or little girls who like to play in the dirt outside and said would literally say things like, "I want to be a boy when I grow up," and they didn't have anything that needed to be diagnosed. They didn't have anything that needed to be identified and therefore substantified, like in the very act. I think this with other kinds of mental illness too. I think with depression, I know many people who, and I think, Matt, this goes to your point. I don't want to be too broad with this and suggest that there is no mental illness, because of course there is. I don't want to suggest that I'm opposed to all medical intervention, because I'm not. But I do think in the vast majority of cases, the person who has the problem is in some ways the least credible voice on the nature of the problem, right? And so many people who I think are good, thoughtful, I have respect for them, I have affection for them, will say, "Well, you don't understand what I'm going through." And I always want to say back to them, "Well, you don't understand what I'm going through." Like, it's the nature of being a human being that we don't understand other people. You're expecting me to accept that your plight is completely distinct from my plight, which I doubt. I find that somewhat unscriptural, and nothing in my observation of life really holds that up. And worse, which with some very specific physical, maybe you're physically being abused or something. I think what's really happening for many people is that they're dealing with the confusion that comes from being a human on the earth. And then as soon as you draw a box around it and give a label to it and provide even the hope of a way out by way of these medical interventions, in many ways, you've now subjected them to the horror of this thing forever. I've said it I want to kick it to Matt, so I'll end with this, but I hate Alcoholics Anonymous. I know many people who've been helped by Alcoholics Anonymous, and thank God for it. When I say I hate it, I mean it kind of on a philosophical level. I hate the idea of someone who has not had a drink in 25 years saying, "I am an alcoholic." Because what they're doing is that they're taking their problem and making their problem central to their identity, even decades after having, in a practical sense, overcome the problem itself. I don't think you could ever have healing from alcoholism if you are an alcoholic. I grew up around Catholics and Baptists. I came from a very German-influenced town, and it's all German Catholics and German Baptists in my little hometown. And the Baptists always say, and listen, I go to a Baptist church today. I love many Baptists, I guess myself included, suddenly. But the Baptists will commonly say, "I'm a sinner saved by grace." And there's a kind of humility to that statement that I really like, except for the emphasis. I think that if one identifies themselves primarily as a sinner, then the natural expectation from them is sin. If one identifies themselves as depressed, the natural thing that you might expect from them is depression. If one identifies themselves as an alcoholic, the natural state of being for them is to imbibe large amounts of alcohol, unhealthy amounts of alcohol. When we make someone's identity their problem, we cannot possibly expect them ever to have relief from that problem.
And I think, to the point about, and I hear this all the time too, that, well, you shouldn't be talking about depression or anxiety because you're not going through it. And there's such an arrogance to that, because I always say, do you really think that I've never experienced depression or anxiety? Do you think there's any human on earth who hasn't? And then the response is, well, it's not like I experience it. First of all, how the hell do you know that?
Yeah.
And second, if you have any understanding of human nature, you should know that everyone struggles with all of these things all the time. Now, I think we talk about, well, how should a human feel? And that is the question that we have farmed out to the psychiatry industry. We farmed it out to the pharmaceutical companies. And we've decided that, they have an answer to that. Even though it's a deeply philosophical, abstract question, there's no reason why they would be experts on how people are supposed to feel or think. My answer is, I think people are supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be joyful even. We're supposed to be content, but that is not a natural, automatic response to just raw human existence.
Yeah.
The natural human response
I mean,
to just,
one of the things.
yeah, the natural human response to existence itself, especially if you take out any sense of meaning, you take religion, you take all that out of it, the natural response is despair and anxiety and dread. Norm Macdonald has a bit that I saw was making the rounds recently where he was saying, when someone commits suicide, everyone always says, "Well, I don't understand why they did it." But really, you don't understand? And it's it sounds kind of morbid. But there's actually first of all, it's actually very empathetic, and it's true. His point is that, well, of course, at some level, you can understand why somebody would despair of existence. If you're a human being and you've lived this life,
To be or not to be actually is the question.
That is the question.
Ben?
But there's something else here too, and that is that when it comes to mental illness, and I've unfortunately had to deal with mental illness in my family, extended family. When you deal with mental illness, one of the ways that I can speak sort of personally here. One of the ways that I think you can tell when somebody really does need help, and we're not talking about somebody who is just feeling some sort of angst and goes to the doctor for a pill, is that outsiders can tell. There are verifiable signs from the outside. You can tell by behavioral characteristics that this person needs help. And one of the main characteristics that I've seen, at least when in dealing with people who are friends and family who are mentally ill, is that they themselves can't tell. This happens a lot, where people are they're extraordinarily deeply anxious, and they can't even tell how anxious they are because they're so inside their own head, or they're so deeply depressed that they can't tell they haven't been eating for days on end. Or they're so obsessive about things that they can't tell that this is coming from outside. They think it's a true desire to just, for example, organize. These are all things that have some verifiable component. One of the things that we've done with mental illness is something that we've done generally, which is we've looked to the emotional self-definition of people and said, you get to be your own best resource. Well, one thing we know from every social science study ever done is that the worst form of social science is self-reports, right? Whenever you're self-reporting about your own status, people are really bad at this. When we say, I know myself the best, that's actually not true. Probably the people who are closest to you know you better than you do, because you have a bizarrely subjective view of yourself, right? You tend to inflate certain parts of yourself and deflate certain parts of yourself. And so when it comes to, the sort of mental condition you're in, one of the dangers that we have very often is people who are self-diagnosing, and then they go to the doctor, and the doctor actually isn't diagnosing them. They're coming in and they're saying, I feel depressed, I need a pill. And the doctor, because the doctor doesn't have the sort of humility to say, I'm not sure that that's the case, right? We actually have to check into this. They just say, okay, well, you say that, you're your own best advocate, right? You're taught that patients are supposed to be their own best advocate. If a patient comes in complaining of knee pain, you don't go, well, let's assess whether you really do have the knee pain. You assume the knee pain is real. But knee pain is not quite the same thing as psychic or emotional pain. Those are not the same thing at all. And very often the people who are the ones who require the most help are the people who actually can't even recognize that they have the problem in the first place. That's particularly true. I saw it in my grandfather of schizophrenia. People who are schizophrenic cannot tell they have a problem. They think they're acting perfectly normally and perfectly naturally, and they're not. They're delusional. And that's why they won't take their meds. Very often the people who most need the meds are the people who won't take the meds, for example.
Between what Matt is saying and what Ben is saying, there's this vast territory that I think is really the problem we have. Because there's going to be mentally ill people, and there's going to be people in despair. But yesterday, I was talking at YAF, and I cited Ben's fantastic creation, the rap song WAP. He did write that, right?
He did write it.
And I was saying that what a despairing view of human life that is. What a terrible, ugly view of life that is. And it's one thing for some rapper to come out with that, but it's another thing when the New York Times and the LA Times says, this is a wonderful song. This is the song of the year. This is a great expression of women's sexuality. And you think, well, now you've got people who are facing the existential pain of life with no support from the authorities, with no support from the establishment. They're being told that this is what you are. This is what you are. You're a WAP, and that's the central thing. You end up then in a state of mental illness that is actually verifiable. That's right. It's caused by the
I actually, by the way, have a lot more respect for Megan Thee Stallion than I do for the New York Times, because she knows that the song is tongue-in-cheek. Yeah. You and I can say that we still think it's vulgar, we don't like it, we don't approve. That's all fine. But she's obviously being cheeky. Only the New York Times elevates it to being an absolute serious work of art.
My whole point is I do not mind there being an obscene little ditty on the radio. It doesn't bother me in the least. It bothers me that there's no old men around to say, that's a terrible thing to say. That's not what you are at all.
You know what? The WAP of it actually ties into something Ben said, and it ties into your movie, Matt, which is It's probably the most interesting part of the movie, and no one has talked about it, which is when you asked the African tribe, you said, what is a woman?
Yeah.
They gave a different answer than the libs did, and a different answer than the conservatives give. Right? The libs say, blah, 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 woman's whatever a woman is, whatever a woman is, whatever. And then the conservatives say, well, if you have two X chromosomes and breasts and a womb, you're a woman. And the Africans didn't say that. They defined it in the way Ben was just talking about. They said, well, a woman is someone who does the role of a woman. A man is someone who does the role of a man, that it's being defined outside of you by other people and by the functions that you have in a political community, which is a deeply, obviously you expect it of the African tribesmen, that's a deeply, deeply conservative point of view that even many American conservatives shy away from.
This is why I think it's hilarious when the trans lefty wackos will say things like, gender is a social construct, and there are 72 of them, and one of them is gender queer. So I'm supposed to believe that this society, which has men's and women's rooms exclusively for going all the way back to the invention of the restroom, also constructed genderqueer. Like the thing itself is so.
If it's a construction, then those are out.
Yeah, there are only two genders, especially if it's a social construct, right? And that's all the social is created. Construction.
I think the answer that they gave me, because they did go right to the duties and responsibilities. And it took a little bit of talking before they got to, well, yeah, obviously a woman has breasts and
body parts.
But what the answer, they didn't even think to answer on that level because they figured, well, why would anyone ask that question? The answer that they were actually answering the question of what ought a woman be? Like what should a woman be?
Like they're acknowledging gender expression, and it's actually maybe conservatives should grant that premise. Say yes, obviously there's such a thing as gender expression, and I guess that's a distinct concept from sex. It's just there's a relationship here. Yeah, they should be pretty close.
But because they have an idea of what a woman should be, what she should do, and same for a man. And that's one of the reasons why they don't have, like Ben pointed out, in these societies where they have a strict idea of roles and responsibilities, they don't have the mental illness and depression. That's a question I actually asked the woman. I can't remember if I made it into the film or not. Do you guys have depression here? And she said, no, we don't have that. And that I think she was being quite sincere. They don't have it because if you're not, in our society where people are wandering around in this haze all the time, they have no idea what they're supposed to be doing or saying or anything, and that's going to create anxiety. I mean, anxiety comes from the unknown. It comes from ambiguity, and so of course we're a society totally besought by anxiety.